All right, brothers and sisters, welcome back to The Last Dispensation. I am your host, Troy, and we have a special guest. I'm exhilarated. I'm nervous. This is Kerry Muhlestein, Professor Muhlestein, right?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
Kerry's fine, but yeah.
He's an Egyptologist. A lot of you know who he is already. You've seen him in roundtables, BYU roundtables, Book of Mormon study groups, Book of Mormon Central. And we're going to interview him, and we're going to talk about the Book of Abraham. And we're also with Brother Palmer. And I'm kind of introducing these two together right now. Brother Palmer, Scott Palmer, has been, you were a stake president and what's it called?
Mission president.
You were also a stake president in
Park City.
Park City, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's pretty iconic. And
it's both kind of a weird place to be a stake president in Utah. Yeah.
Afterwards, we'll have to talk and see if we know some of the same people. But
I bet we do. Yeah.
And you were a mission president in the Salt Lake City, Utah mission. And I was also.
It was a Salt Lake City West mission, so different than when you were there. But we crossed paths area-wise, different
That's
times.
Right. I served my mission in Salt Lake City in 1992 to 94.
Yeah.
So we have some background there. Okay, and here we go. Brother Muhlestein received his bachelor's from BYU in psychology with a Hebrew minor as an undergraduate. He spent time at the BYU Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies in the intensive Hebrew program, received an MA in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from BYU and a PhD from UCLA in Egyptology. He also taught early morning seminary at the Westwood Institute of Religion. He was selected by the Princeton Review in 2012 as one of the best 300 professors in the nation. And he and his wow. And he and his wife, Julianne, are the parents of 6 children. He's also served on a committee for the Society of this for the Study of Egyptian Antiquities and currently serves on their board of trustees. He's a senior fellow of the William F. Albright Institute for Archaeological Research, and he's the director of the BYU Egypt Excavation Project in association with his works on understanding the pyramid excavated there, as well as the Graeco-Roman culture represented at the site in the advent of Christianity in Egypt. Did I get all that right?
Yeah.
Did I leave anything out?
I think you put people to sleep is what you did. So, we'll just have to. I need to find a shorter bio to put on. I think that's from my college's website. I think that it was written by people who like boring things. But anyway, I'll have to find something shorter there.
Well, I know that I was watching you were just on Come Follow Him with John, by the way. And who's his co-host? I forgot.
Hank Smith.
Yeah, Hank Smith. And
Smith.
Yeah. And he kept mentioning the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And that song.
Yeah, those guys are smart, Alex.
You are kind of in that area of Egyptology, though. So you just came out with a book called Let's Talk About the Book of Abraham.
Yeah.
My wife and I just read it. Brothers and sisters, this was very thorough and informative on how to discern truth more than anything. It helped me rekindle my ability to seek truth through the Spirit and also other lenses and senses that the Lord has blessed me with. I'm going to go right for the jugular. In your book, you talk about ways of knowing things and even the process of revelation, how we come to understand things through the revelatory process. And then there's the academic process.
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned intuitive, authoritative, logical, and empirical. See, I read it.
Yeah. So that's the field of epistemology you're going through there. The different ways that we know or can know something. Yeah.
Do you mind briefly explaining that a little bit and how that applies to knowing what is true?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I hope I've done it in the book in a way that is understandable. The book was aimed at, I mean, it was almost an impossible task. Fortunately, I had a lot of very good, they found the very best reviewers, 3 different experts in different subjects of the field that came back and helped me hammer through usually it's a blind review, and they all 3 said, you know what, let's help him do this, because we were trying to take really complex subjects and make them really understandable for anyone in a short, readable amount of space. So the difficult thing was to cut, and still make it understandable, hopefully interesting and precise and accurate. So hopefully I've done that with this chapter as well. The original draft, the chapter where we talk about how, the original draft was much longer. But anyway, the idea is that there are only a few ways we know things. It's called epistemology, and there are a few ways that we know. But typically we kind of combine those things into what I call, and this is those levels are not things I came up with. That's kind of an accepted disciplinary idea, but I came up with this idea of the way we combine them into certain processes. So, for example, and I think this is what I say in the book. If not, it's hopefully close. You'll take what is known as the intuitive process, which includes inspiration or revelation. But that never operates by itself, because we get inspiration and it always combines with our own ideas in our own mind, so that we make conclusions, logical conclusions. So there's the second, this kind of epistemological way of knowing. We take our own logic and we interpret the inspiration that we've gotten. So I don't know about you, but most people I know, and it certainly happened with me, where I've gotten inspiration to do something and I logically concluded it was so that this and this and this would happen. But as I did it, none of that was happening. And then it turns out it was actually so that something better and better and better would happen that was totally off my radar, but it was on God's radar, right? So that's the revelatory process, which is kind of starting with God, but it involves us as well, right? And sometimes we're better at that than others. But hopefully, the more we work with it, the more we're better. And sometimes being better means waiting on that logical part, waiting to see something, right? But anyway, so that's the revelatory process. We have something similar with what I call the academic process, which we use our deductive reasoning and observing things. And both of these involve authority, by the way. The revelatory process, we look to God for the authority. Authority is one of those epistemological ways of learning. With the academic process, we look to people who have studied a lot as authority. So, for example, I would be an authority on these things that I've studied a lot. But of course, some things I only kind of know, and I'm relying on someone else's authority because they really delved into that aspect and so on, right? So we all do that. So you have you have authority, you have observations, and logical reasoning, and you take all of that together and you come to a conclusion. And my point that I make in the book is that we should pursue every avenue of learning available to us on every subject, right? So I am not dismissing the academic process. I make my living off of the academic process. I'm passionate about the academic process. I spend tons of time in the academic process. And it can do a lot of great things for us. And I understand the Book of Abraham on an intellectual and a spiritual level better because of the academic engagement I've given it. At the same time, we have to recognize the limitations. And in this case, there is so much data that we don't have that the academic process is fairly limited in what it can tell us about some questions about the Book of Abraham. Actually, about most questions, almost everything, there's something I'd like to know more about. But anyway, but especially the key questions of whether this is inspired writings from Abraham who is inspired by God. All right. So that's the key question. And frankly and honestly, and I think that anyone who is, I know there are people who disagree with me on this, but I think that anyone who is willing to be intellectually honest and careful and cautious about the data that we have and the conclusions that we can reach with that data would agree that that the academic process does not have enough data to yield a reliable conclusion on that question. The revelatory process has access to more information. It comes from God, and God knows the information that I don't. And thus, the revelatory process is more reliable on this issue. Frankly, the revelatory process is more reliable on all issues because God always knows more than we do. And it's built into the academic process that we're going to continually overturn what we used to think. I've refuted myself in writing. There are no textbooks really that you ever use that are more than 10 years old because there's too much wrong information in it by the time it's 10 years old, although we thought it was right when it first came out. And that's the way the academic process works, is we're always figuring out, oh, we were wrong about that, right? We were wrong about Newtonian physics. A lot of it worked well enough to do some incredible stuff, but we were wrong about a lot of it. And we're figuring that out. But God is never wrong. And so the revelatory process is always more reliable. It just so happens that God doesn't give us revelation on most things, right? He's not going to reveal. It's unlikely he's going to reveal to me where Moses sat when or stood when he saw the burning bush, right? But so we can't use the revelatory process for everything, but on this issue, we can. God will tell us if the Book of Abraham is inspired writings, whereas the academic process is incapable. And so that's one chapter in the book, but I think it's an important chapter in there.
Yeah. Thank you. Did you want to add something, Scott?
I want to ask Kerry a question. I've never had the opportunity to speak to an Egyptologist, and I've been to Egypt once.
You're probably lucky that you haven't had a lot of conversations. We're often odd people.
I love Egypt, and there's so many questions I have. But first off, I have to ask one. But my wife wanted me to ask you, and that is, do you take tours to Egypt?
I do, not often, and because I'm usually teaching or excavating, but I do take tours. So afterwards, if you want, I can tell you how to. Well, actually, this might be useful for everyone. So it's not directly related to the tours, but kind of. Yeah. I have a website where I try and put more information about the Book of Abraham, more information about the Old Testament, all sorts of stuff. It's a bad website because I designed it, and I'm not a web guy. I'm an Egyptologist. But it's called outofthedust.org. And you can go there to find more resources on the Book of Abraham. Right now, I'm trying to put it just like chock full of information about the Old Testament to help people with studying the Old Testament this year. I'm spending all my time on there. I created my own podcast that you can find on there just to help people understand the Old Testament. It also has, the podcast is called The Scriptures Are Real, but it also has a page about Get Involved. And if you go there, you can learn some of the ways you maybe could learn about tours. So,
I want to leave. I would like to leave links to everything that you possibly want people to connect with.
Okay.
So you can email me those things or whatever.
Right. Sounds great.
And I
will do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question I have is with the Book of Abraham, one of the greatest things I think that come out of that is this idea of a premortal existence.
Yes.
So we know that the Egyptians, throughout most of their dynasties and everything, they were obsessed with life after death. Is there a lot of evidence, or is there some evidence of them being aware and having a knowledge of a premortal existence as well?
There is just a little bit of evidence on that. And you're right, in terms of the Book of Abraham, that's one of the more important doctrines. In fact, if you look at in General Conference, when the Book of Abraham is cited, by far the most common reason it's cited is looking at Abraham chapter 3 and premortal existence. The other one is Abrahamic covenant, and priesthood and Abrahamic covenant. But so that's an important doctrine that comes from there. And yes, the Egyptians had some inklings and notions of it. They talk about, for kings at least, and sometimes queens as kings, but being formed like before they were in the egg is the phrase they use for before being pregnant, the mother is pregnant with them and so on. And so just a couple little references like that give us a teeny bit of information. I'll also tell you where there's a website called pearlofgreatpricecentral.org. That's pearlofgreatpricecentral.org, where there's a series of essays on elements of the Book of Abraham, and they talk a little bit about some of the elements in the Book of Abraham that we also find in Egyptian culture. So a little teeny bit about premortality, but also about creation by councils of gods and things like that. So that's some of those kinds of questions. That's a good resource to go to pearlofgreatpricecentral.org.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I thought about all the questions I wanted to ask you, I wanted to come from an angle that when I say regular members of the church, I mean non-scholars, like those who grew up with the standard works, but don't really know a lot of the things that we're talking about. Okay, let's see. Why is it important to know that there is more than one way of knowing the Book of Abraham is true?
It's a great question, and it's because of this. There are several reasons, but the one I'm thinking of right now is it's because of this. There are a number of people who tend to simplify and sometimes knowingly, but I think the vast majority of them unknowingly represent wrong facts about the Book of Abraham, including assumptions that they present as facts and complex issues they present as simplified. And then they take this wrong or simplified information and they say, when you put A and B together this way, it shows that we can prove that Joseph Smith is not a prophet. So first of all, they're not either unintentionally or intentionally. I think most of the time it's people relying on authority figures who either didn't do their job right or had an agenda, but or didn't recognize their unnoticed assumptions. And I've written about these unnoticed assumptions lots of times and so on. But and I'll give you an example in 1 second. But most people who write about it or post about it or anything else are relying on these authority figures that have done their academic conclusions on this poorly. And they say that we can come to a conclusion that honestly, academically, we're not able to come to. And that's why it's worth stopping and thinking about how can we really know that? What are we capable of answering? What aren't we capable of answering? And I would also suggest that people should be aware of the motives and the methods of the authorities they're relying on, right? So I'm very clear and transparent. I am a believing member of the church. I believe because of revelatory experiences I've had. I'm upfront about that. And I know that affects the way I filter the evidence. I try and see everything from all sides, but I know it affects the way I filter the evidence and my ability to look from all sides. The funny thing is that somehow in our increasingly secular world, we've gotten to the point where we will say, okay, well, that's a faith-based choice, so we should kind of discount that. And we'll look at someone else who doesn't believe, which is a faith-based choice. They have chosen not to believe because you can't prove or disprove, for example, whether God exists or Joseph Smith is a prophet and so on. So they've made a faith-based choice to not believe, but somehow this secular society or secular culture has been able to foist upon so many of us the idea that, okay, that's not really a faith-based choice, so that's objective, and we should listen to them more than someone else. And I find that ironic because I'm being upfront about my conclusions and how I come to them and how I'm influenced. And those who have chosen not to believe are not being upfront about it and are pretending like they're in a place that they're not. And that gets a little bit frustrating, and it's harmful for people who are, whether intending or not, they're duped by this. So we need to help people stop and look and recognize both are a faith-based choice. Let's be upfront and honest about it. You should know the faith-based choice and filter or interpretive lens, however you want to phrase that, of the people you're reading. And that will enable you to sift through their arguments a little bit better, and then look carefully at their arguments and are they giving you all the information, and are they doing more with that information than you really can do, and so on and so on. And I think I really believe, both from my revelatory experiences, but also from the academic process and my abilities and training in the academic process, that anyone who will do that will come to the conclusion that we do not have enough data to make academic or logical conclusions about this issue, and those who are saying we can are either intentionally or unintentionally, they are wrong. And I really believe that, and I think that if people will look more carefully at their sources and people's ideas, that they'll come to that same conclusion.
Yeah,
I love that. I love what you said there. And couldn't you use that with the academic side too? Because there's so many different theories on Egypt, on the pharaohs, when the pyramids were built, and so if you're kind of trained in the traditional sense of, you know, Khufu and that the Great Pyramid was a tomb and all that, and then you close off any other insights and evidence that it could be something else. Right. You shut off a whole other thing, and that's not the spiritual side of it, but it's still kind of the same thing. We have to keep an open mind for all of it, right? Yeah, it is true, and you're right. Like, we're coming to the, and I thought I would be part of the vanguard of this and started on my dissertation, and then figured out a lot of people were just ahead of me, and I wrote my dissertation on something else. But we're coming to the conclusion that the pyramid was probably at least as much a temple, I think probably more a temple than it is a tomb. But that's not something we thought for a long time. And so to use that and some other things, I didn't give you the example I said I would earlier, so I'll come back to that. Yeah. But to use this as an example, the best scholars, in my experience, the best scholars are the ones who have a healthy dose of humility, who recognize their limitations, the limitations of the data and the discipline, and are just willing to make the conclusions that it's possible to make and not make more than that, and be honest about, okay, I think this, but I don't know. And that leaves them open to new ideas as well. And that's the way the best scholars and the best scholarship happen. And that's not what we are typically seeing in Book of Abraham studies. So to give you an idea, I told you I'd give you an example of a false assumption. And this is one that just has thrown a lot of people with the Book of Abraham. We recovered in 1967 the fragment of papyrus that has the original facsimile one. Facsimile one is a facsimile of the drawing on that papyrus. And everyone, it's a natural assumption, but everyone assumed that Joseph Smith was translating from the text that's around that drawing. So there's text on either side of that drawing. And everyone assumed that Joseph Smith was translating from that text. Natural assumption. And then we translate that text. We couldn't in Joseph Smith's day, but we can in our day. And it turns out to be an Egyptian funerary document called the Book of Breathings. And so for
it does.
Yeah. The text that surrounds the drawing on
so it wasn't Abraham being sacrificed, or the attempted sacrifice of Abraham? That's not what the text is. All right. So I'm not talking about the drawing itself, but the text around that. Yeah. The text, the hieroglyphic characters around that translate to talk about Egyptian funerary stuff. So if you go with the assumption that that's what Joseph Smith was translating from, then you can say, now we've proved that Joseph Smith didn't translate this correctly. The problem is it's an assumption. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that, well, let's move that. Let's make it into a hypothesis and possibly a theory. Let's test it. Right. So most people never did, because they never even noticed it was an assumption. They just said, of course, that's what he's doing. But we have to notice those assumptions and then test them. And I won't go into depth here, but I figured out at least 3 ways to test it. And I'm not the first one. On some of them, I've gone more into depth than others, and on others, I haven't. But as you test it, those 3 ways, one way tells you it may or may not be a good theory or hypothesis. The other one says it's probably not a good hypothesis. And the third way, which is actually the most accurate way that we have the most information on, that's looking at the eyewitnesses or the historical sources, people who heard from Joseph Smith or someone close to Joseph Smith what he was translating from. When we look at that one, it's almost certainly not. I don't know that we're at 100%, but we're in the 90% percentile that is a bad hypothesis. All right. So now we've gone beyond presumptions, and we've made it a hypothesis, which is a null hypothesis, or we disprove it.
You can't ever prove hypotheses, right? But you can disprove them. This one is for 95% disproved. And so then we can say, okay, then actually that it turns out that we can't come to a conclusion about Joseph Smith as an inspired translator based on looking at the text around facsimile 1. That academically, that's not tenable. We just don't have enough an ability to do that.
Interesting.
I love that. That's great.
Let's see here. Did you have a question, Scott?
I was wondering on that when you brought up the facsimile number 1.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is just my personal stuff, but it looks like the canopic jars underneath.
Mm-hmm.
What are the significance of those in relation to the explanation versus what we kind of commonly think of those with the organs and all that kind of stuff? What's the relationship of all that?
Great question. And I'll answer that briefly here. It's a little bit more in depth in the book.
I know. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, this is how we have to do it. We do stages of depth of answers, right? So it's even more in depth. I just did on my own podcast, even a little bit more in depth on that. Although we referenced the video that I'm having a hard time editing to get that up. So sorry to anyone who's looking for the video, but one day it'll be up. Anyway, I'm a newbie at this. I don't know what in the world I'm doing with this.
It's okay.
So typically in that kind of a scene, and I'll just say that it's almost a common Egyptian scene, facsimile 1. It's almost a common scene, but it's not. There are some really different things that are significantly different that work well with Joseph Smith's story. And I'm starting to lean more and more and more towards the idea that it was a vignette. That's what we call those drawings. It was a vignette that was designed to work with both the Book of Breathings and the Book of Abraham. I'm starting to lean towards that, but frankly, we don't have enough information to really know. In any case, so typically underneath that kind of we call it a lion couch that Abraham is on, or the figure is on there. It's a lion couch or an altar or whatever, and it's often used for mummification, but in some scenes it's clearly not mummifications, it's other things. And this one matches the temple scenes they're not mummification scenes. But anyway, even then you usually have underneath there what we call canopic jars, which in mummification you mummify different organs of the body and put them in there. But they're thought of as the 4 sons of Horus. There are 4 different figures there. They each have a name. They're the sons of Horus. And they're gods that have roles and functions. All right. Now, Joseph Smith says that there are these Canaanite gods. So that's actually makes a tremendous amount of sense if you're familiar with the culture and history of what's happening in Abraham's day. So in Abraham's day, the Egyptians are controlling a number of places up and north of them, strategically choosing what places they will really control, where they want to put in the effort to really control it so that they can control military and trade routes and just become more powerful and wealthy, right? Other places that they kind of control. And then there are a lot of places around there that kind of end up being accidentally culturally controlled, right? That just the cultural influence. It's a little bit like right now, Hollywood has a cultural influence that maybe we didn't intend for it to have, but it does, and it influences the culture of people all around the place. So Egypt, any of the peripheral areas from these areas where they had strong control ended up with lots of cultural influence and control in those areas. All right. So in the areas around, say, north and west of Haran, which is where I would guess the is that Abraham is from, and that's another long, complicated thing. But I would guess that's where he is from, and there's actually some interesting evidence for that. But that's areas where there's a lot of Egyptian control and influence. And when there is Egyptian control and influence, we almost always get what we call syncretization of religious practices. And that's when you start mixing and merging 2 religious ideas, including gods and the identity of gods. So that the Egyptians and the people in these areas I'm talking about where the Egyptians had a presence were famous. They're all famous for this, where they will merge different gods that are kind of similar in idea and put them together. So Now that seems weird to us because we're monotheistic, but if you're polytheistic, then you just grab every religious idea out there and you throw it all together because why not? I want to make all gods happy.
All
right?
gods are good.
That's right. And, or at least should be pleased, whether they're good or not.
Right.
You want to make them happy. And so, and if you see some that have similar characteristics, so just as an example, the priest who owned that papyrus that facsimile one was on, he's a priest. One of the gods he's a priest for is a god called Min, but a particular form of Min that's called Min who massacres his enemies. And the Egyptians saw a Canaanite god named Resheph, who they thought had similar attributes. And so in their mind, Min who massacres his enemies and Resheph were different aspects of the same god, and they syncretized them and worshiped them together as the same god. I would guess you have the same thing going on with these four sons of Horus, who, as those gods coming, the Egyptians bring the idea of those gods to Canaanites. The Canaanites already have some ideas of some gods, and they say, oh, these things are kind of similar, and the identities merge. They're syncretized. It's really common. It's happening a lot in those exact areas at that exact time period, a merging of Egyptian and Canaanite religious practices. And so it's not surprising at all. Now, here's one other fun thing to throw in there. Those four sons of Horus are not only in facsimile 1, they're also in facsimile 2.
That's right. Yeah.
I think it's figure 6 is the number, but those four standing figures that Joseph Smith says represent the four corners of the earth, or the earth in its four. I can't remember exactly how it says it. Is it the earth in its four corners? Is that what he says?
They're upside down, and they're yeah. Represents the earth and its four quarters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Four quarters. Yeah. That was the word. I knew corners wasn't right. The four quarters.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Egyptologically, we know that the four sons of Horus were associated with the four cardinal directions. So that's a perfect match, right? And again, it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't find them then by the Canaanites being syncretized in a different way with gods that may have some similar element or something along those lines. So
something that might have one time appeared that Joseph Smith didn't know what he was talking about, which he probably didn't know what he was talking about because it was
he didn't. But Abraham knew what he was talking about.
But Abraham did. Yeah. Abraham, and then and therefore that's just that explanation that you gave is more evidence that this is inspired. Yeah, because Joseph Smith wouldn't know to combine those things. No. In fact, it looks worse at time. Early on, it would look worse.
Yeah,
but now that we know what we know and what you explained so well, it's more evidence that this is an inspired translation to me.
Yeah. I think it's evidence. I mean, I'm always of the position, none of this proves Joseph Smith is a prophet. I don't think it's capable of doing that, but it's a confirming nudge. I have a friend named Dr. Jared Ludlow, who this is his phrase that I love. It's a confirming nudge to our already existing faith. Right. And let me throw one more on, as long as we're talking about those four sons of Horus or these Canaanite gods on facsimile 1. And Joseph Smith gives us names for those gods, none of which were known in Joseph Smith's day, but now all four of which we have found are the names of gods that we would expect from that time place. Some of them we know a lot more about than others. My colleague, Dr. John Gee, has just published an article on this, about this, well, not just a little while ago, on the Interpreter Foundation's website, interpreter.org. He's got an article, but again, I mean, either Joseph Smith is the luckiest guesser ever, or he's inspired. Those are your two choices, right? And you have to decide which one takes more faith, to have faith that he continually is the luckiest guesser the world has ever known, or to believe he's inspired. But to me, that's really interesting that those are legitimate names for gods in that time period and place. That's not bad.
No, not at all.
So good. Another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. He's actually answering all my questions.
That's because I just talk too much.
It's good.
I don't know if I'll ever get this opportunity again. In your opinion, any relationship between Akhenaten and Moses?
No, probably not.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, I can't answer 100% for sure, but I would guess not. But a lot of people thought so.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right.
Now, let me ask you, not really off topic, but what what fascinated you first? Was it your drive to find out these things about the Book of Abraham, or were you just fascinated with Egyptology first?
I was Egyptology first. I actually was planning on completely avoiding anything to do with the Book of Abraham. I was just drawn into Egyptology. It was really the Exodus story, which I have done some work on, but that's where I wanted to go, is understand Egypt from both the biblical side. So, you read that long, boring bio, but I had a degree in biblical Hebrew, and then at UCLA, my degree was in Egyptology, but my secondary emphasis was Hebrew language and literature. And I was really fascinated with all these times where we see the Bible interacting with ancient Egypt, and that's where I really wanted to pursue. But I really was thinking, I don't want to get involved in this whole Book of Abraham thing. That's a quagmire, which it is. But it just meaning that is, once you get into it, then people just keep
it's like rabbit holes.
Excited about it. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there were so many people that had questions about it and expected me, because I was getting a degree in Egyptology, to have answers to that. I thought, well, rather than embarrass myself, I ought to at least start to look into it. And it was pretty interesting. It became fascinating to me. But I'd say for the most part, I got into it because I saw the need. I saw so many people that really were struggling to find answers. They wanted to know answers. There are a number of people who don't want to know. They just want to say nasty stuff and move on, or not move on. But there are a lot of people who really have legitimate questions. And I felt like, well, I am in a position to help these people if I'll just put the time and effort into it. And I had some people who urged me to do that in various positions here and there. And so between all of that, I just got more and more into it until now. While there are days I'd like to leave it behind when people say really nasty things, but for the most part, it is something that is becomes so interesting and fascinating to me. It's just one of those puzzles where you just can't quite stop, right? Like, okay, there's some more data that is going to help me understand this a little bit, but there's some more. There's some more, and it's a trail that you just can't quite following. So it's become fascinating to me, and I love that my combination of. So if you're going to study the Book of Abraham, there are so many elements. There's the biblical element. There's the Egyptological element. There's an Egyptological element in Abraham's day and in the days that the papyri were recorded, which is the Greco-Roman era. Then there's the 19th century element, right? The papyri coming over and the history with Joseph Smith and after Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out through just a number of different reasons and series of events that I ended up with some serious training and experience in 19th century history and working on 19th century documents and archives and historical analysis, and with biblical studies and Egyptological studies that originally was more in the classical pharaonic period, but ended up that I also had to become very, very familiar with the Greco-Roman period because I excavated Greco-Roman cemetery. So I've just had this strange confluence of events that have made it so that I'm one of the, like, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 people that has training in all of the areas that you need to really fully do Book of Abraham studies. And I just kind of felt like, well, if I have been put in that position, I probably should do something about it and help people find the answers that they would like to find.
Wow, that is incredible.
I really enjoyed your book. It was very like you said, jam-packed, full of information. It seems like it was a lot bigger.
Yeah,
and
it's small print. It's a teeny tiny book, and then it's small print. Guys with bad eyes like me are like, "What does that say?" But so there's a lot of information in that small little book. But I hope it's readable and understandable.
Yeah. It was, and I found it fascinating that like you said, the Canaanite influence on Egypt.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's
so good.
Very fascinating. Did you have some more questions?
I had one question on just, this is kind of unrelated, but what I think it was last fall or summer, Elder Holland voiced some concerns about the kind of the culture of what's going on at BYU. Do you experience any of that in your field or in your departments that you're working with, of any of those things that Elder Holland expressed a concern? I know it's kind of department, in different departments. I was just wondering if you experience any of that, what he expressed.
You're making reference to his address to faculty and staff at the beginning of the academic year.
Yeah, exactly.
Where he talked about that he would like to see us be more supportive, use our academic training and abilities to be supportive of the church and not sometimes to use them to take shots at the church, basically. I know some people who I think may not have realized that they were doing that. In their mind, I think that's not what they were doing. And I hope that they were able to see from his address that they were. I think it's a very, very, very small minority. I happen to be surrounded by a lot of people who are really, really consecrated to using all of their abilities and their academic training to support the brethren. And maybe, I don't know, I can't speak to each person's motivation, but I know for myself, of course, I want to support the brethren. But what I find is that if I just am in the spirit of investigation, if I just want to learn and understand, and I use all of all of me, right? So that's the revelatory, the academic, everything. We bring everything to the table to try and understand that it always ends up supporting the brethren. So I don't have to start out with that goal, although certainly I do want to do that, but I don't have to start out with that goal. I believe, I'm so fully convinced that we have inspired prophetic leaders that I don't even have to worry about that. I believe that if I just try to find out the real story to as much as possible, that will inevitably end up supporting the brethren because they're using the revelatory method, and that's not wrong, right? So, and I think that's where a lot of people that I know are, and there are a few who maybe, hopefully, have understood that they may not have been doing that perfectly.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Okay, that's really good. I hadn't talked to anybody that actually is in the position you're in that could see it from your perspective. And I like what you said, that some of them might not have even realized that they were doing what Elder Holland suggested they might be doing. And
yeah, it'll come back.
Yeah. And I do think that most people think that they are trying to help and do good. I think that's most people's motivations. Yeah. Sometimes we get so taken in by the world or our own ideas or whatever else that we don't realize that that's not what we're doing. And I'm sure we all have instances where we do that. I'm convinced that every single one of us have had times where we thought we were doing things well, but we were so swayed by the world or our own pride or whatever else that actually what we were doing was not helpful when we thought it was. And so we have to continually realign ourselves with the brethren. Yeah. And I think if we're continually checking and realigning ourselves with the brethren, that's the antidote to a problem that we all suffer.
Love that.
Are you finding that your contemporaries that study the same things you do as far as the Book of Abraham's concerned, are you guys coming more to terms with, like, in agreement with each other?
Well, yes and no.
And I'm talking about Latter-day Saint scholars.
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, the more we understand that, in some ways, the more research we do, the more we'll come together. But it always has a phase of how to interpret the data, right? There's always this bit, you find data and it does involve interpretation, and people who pretend like it doesn't aren't good scholars, to be honest. So it involves interpretation. And there's always a while of trying to figure out how do we really interpret that. I think we're largely in agreement, and where we're not, it's helpful. So, I talked about reviewers on this book. One of them who's fantastic, and I would name him, but I don't know if he wants me to name him or not. So without his permission, I won't. But a fantastic scholar on the 19th century phase of the Book of Abraham. And he disagrees with me on a number of things. On a lot of things we agree, but he disagrees with me on a number of things. And the two of us having to hammer out, well, why do you think that? Because I think this, and so on. Working on that to make this book as accurate as possible was phenomenal. I did learn and understand, and I came to recognize that a couple of positions that I thought just couldn't work, well, maybe they can work. And I think he shifted the same way a little bit. So when we're willing to sit down and talk these things through. We're not in 100% agreement, but we now can understand the reasonableness of each other's positions. We've, I think, come to understand which positions are not tenable and also could be faith damaging, even if they're not tenable. So there's some things that aren't tenable. There's some things we may or may not know. And so you throw the speculation out there. And if some of those, they may not be a good idea to throw out there. Right. But I think at least my experience in that case was when we were willing to sit down and hammer this stuff out, we came to understand each other, and we came up with a much better understanding and product as a result of our willingness to work it out. And we were much closer to being on the exact same page than we were before. I would be sad if we were always on the exact same page, because then that means we're probably not progressing very well.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is so good.
Yeah. And as long as there's not any other outside influences, like somebody wrote so many books, so they feel like they have to continue with that stance. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Again, the best scholars are the ones who are willing to say I was wrong.
For them. Or
yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying that they're people like that, but
well, there are people like that, but
yeah,
I don't know about in Book of Abraham studies, but there are people.
It's kind of like the heartland theory of the Book of Mormon.
I'm not going to go there, but the best scholars are the ones who are willing to say, you know what, I was wrong on that. And in fact, I've sat in classes and I've talked to John Gee, and he's had the exact same experience, where when you're studying with the best scholars and they'll pull out, you'll be covering a subject that they have written and researched on, and they'll pull out something. They're like, man, why did I say that? I don't know. That was stupid. Throw that away. And so on. You know, that's what a good scholar is. He's willing to admit, oh, my methodology, my data was wrong, or we've learned more, and it invalidates it. And that's great. Let's move forward from here. But there is a tendency in academia to instead entrench yourself and fight against the new information or knowledge. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very, very much. You answered a lot of my questions. Did you have any more, Scott?
No, that was so wonderful. What a privilege. Thank you for letting me come along.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And brothers and sisters, we're going to have the links to the podcasts, the book. It's an easy read. It's not very long, and I think that was by design.
Yeah.
And we'll have the link that's on to Deseret Books or wherever you can find it.
Right now, I think they're the only ones that have it immediately available. Eventually, Amazon and Siegel and everyone else will have it. But like right now, Amazon has it as a pre-order where you can get it right now at Deseret Books. So let's just give you that link.
All right. And plus the podcast and everything else.
All right.
Okay. But one more question.
Yeah.
How do non-LDS scholars feel about your work?
Depends on which work you're talking about. So my Egyptological work is fairly well accepted. As far as Book of Abraham work, I think most of them don't care.
Right.
There are some that I've talked about who say, okay, well, I understand what you're trying to do and I appreciate it. I've had some that said, okay, I understand what you're saying about these facsimiles, but I think you ought to let your people know what they mean from an Egyptological point of view as well. And I've actually been working on that and so on. But respect what we're doing Egyptologically. And if I sit down and talk with them about the Egyptological aspects of what I'm doing with the Book of Abraham, they'll say, okay, I can see that, but I don't think that the Book of Abraham, right? I'm not going to go where you go with it, but I can see what you're doing there.
Do you find that more with faith-based Egyptologists as opposed to agnostic or
there are very, very, very few faith-based Egyptologists.
Okay.
There are a couple, but they're very few. And with them, they understand the work I'm doing. We haven't actually talked about it a lot because most likely it would turn into, I'm in good terms with a number of them that I know are faith-based. And we talk about all sorts of interesting things and they're aware of what we're doing, but it would turn into okay, well, let's have an evangelical LDS debate, and that's not really where any of us want to or are intending to go, right? So, and it wouldn't be about the Book of Abraham; it would just be about the things that evangelicals and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints debate on. So I've only really talked about it with some of my closest friends, and then still only lightly. It's just kind of a place that they just don't want to go. They don't want to get involved because they've seen the nasty stuff that happens to those that do get involved. And honestly, if you get involved, if you're an Egyptologist that gets involved in this, you're going to be attacked by everyone from every side. It's just how it rolls, which is a sad thing. And I wish it wasn't the case. So most of them don't want to get involved. But those that I have talked with, even the teeniest bit, say, okay, I get where you're going. I appreciate it. And you go there. I'm not.
Got it.
Awesome.
All right. Did we leave anything out?
Boy, this has been
we
great.
left a lot out, but
yeah, it's been wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Kerry.
my pleasure.
Appreciate it.